On the chart, by which number or numbers do you see? You know, the over, I'm talking about. So I'm seeing a lot of those 4 and 5, and then if you have something other than 4 and 5 rates, then I saw some 3s. I saw more 3s than 2s. So we'll do 3, 4, and 5. Not supposed to be better, so we'll be writing kind of slow. Might be better, might be worse than my normal handwriting. So for number 3, we're solving. We have a fraction that equals another fraction. So we are going to cross multiply. So 6 times a minus 6 equals 8 times a minus 1. Distribute on both sides. And then, so just looking at what we have here, how many solutions would we have? 1, none, definitely many. 1, none, definitely none. So looking at our coefficients, they're different. So that would tell you have how many solutions? 1, none, and 1. So then we can pick and choose what we want to solve. Let's say we subtracted 6 into both sides and added 8 to both sides. So we get, what is that? Negative 6 plus 8. Negative 1. Negative 28. Anyway. Divide both sides. I need the 3. Negative. So that A would equal negative 1. Questions on that one? All right, number 4, we are evaluating. Put 9 in where x is. It would be 2 times the cube root of negative 1 plus 9. On the inside, we can combine negative 1 and 9 to get 8. Right, except now on the inside. Take the cube root of 8, or what times what times what, will be 8, which is 2. So it'll be 2 times 2. And that final answer would be. So if you got 4, good job. If you do not, go ahead and fix that. If you have any questions about that. Then for the last one, we needed to distribute. So the 1/4 to everything there, the negative 2/3 to everything there. So sorry, it would be 5/4x. Plus, I'm just gonna multiply it as it is, and then we'll simplify it. 16/12. If you went ahead and simplified it, that's okay. Minus 6/12 x minus 2/6 equals -5. We can simplify 3 of these. 5/4 x will stay the same. Then we have 4/3 minus 1/2 x minus 1/3 equals -5. So if this is where you started, that's fine. And then we could combine like terms. So for the x's, this would be you would either do this in the calculator or by hand. The 5/4 minus the 1/2, if by hand you have to multiply both to make them both 4. Or if you did it in the calculator, it would be 5/4 minus 2/4. So 3/4 x. And then 4/3 minus 1/3 will give us 3/3 plus 3/3 equals -5. If the 3/3 becomes 1, and we are going to subtract 1 to both sides. So you just write -1 on both sides. So 3/4 x equals -6. 3/4 x equals -6. And then to get rid of the 3/4, take it, flip it, and multiply on both sides by 4/3. So that x would equal -24/3 or negative. And that would be your final. Questions on that one? Make sure your name is on that and go ahead and pass that up. While you're doing that, also note from last class, the writing linear equation. No, sorry. More like make sure you guys have this out. In your notes, find this beat. So we did 3 of these, then we went for 3. And I said we're gonna do this part next. So this is gonna be similar to what we did last time, but with the next cell. Because we have to write the equation of the line that goes through 2 points. So before we had a point in the slope, now we have 2 points. But we can use those 2 points to find the slope and then do it. So reminder, we find our slope, we're using our y2 minus y1 over our x2 minus x. So if you need to label them, you can do that. So let's find our slope of number 1. I'm gonna go ahead and label them. We don't need to start it. So this will be 4 minus 1 over 2 minus. Subtract. What would that slope be? Which would simplify to be what? Right, so our slope is -3. Now we have 2 points and the slope. So what we did before is now going to apply, but you have a choice of which point do you want. So you can go with the first one because it says x1, y1, but you can also use the second one, it's the same. So I'm going to show you that both work, but you don't have to write both down. So let's say we use the first one. This would be our x1, this would be our y1, this would be our m. And we would use that formula that we wrote at the top of our paper. Y minus our y1, which is 1, equals our slope, our -3, parentheses, x minus our x1, which is also. Distribute. The y minus 1 equals -3x plus 9. And add 1 on both sides. The y equals, what's our negative equation? You don't have a whole lot of space underneath here, so you can either, if you want to do this part, you can do it lower or up higher. So this is the end, but I'm showing you that the other one also works. So let's say we found our slope here, that's still step 1, but instead of using the first one, I use the second point. That would be y minus 4, I'll put this up here in a second, equals -3 times x minus 2. And you would do the same process, distribute and add 4 to both sides. So it does not matter which point you choose. As long as you do your math correctly, either one should give you the right. Do you have any questions about that? Let's try a couple more. Let's do number 2. Let's find our slope first. Label them if you need to. We have -8 minus 12 over 4 minus a negative 1. Negative 8 minus 12 would give us what? 24 minus a negative 1 would give us 5. Because this would become plus, we're adding. And if we divide this, our slope would be -4. Right, we have a choice. Do we want to use the first point or the second point? Okay. If you want to use the first instead, go for it. So this is going to be, even though we use it as x2, y2, this is going to be like our x1, y1. So we have y minus -8 equals our slope -4, parentheses x minus. I will say if you chose the other point, instead of having the negative here, have it inside, still need to keep that first. But in this case, this is so y plus 8 equals -4x plus 15. Careful with your negatives. Subtract 8. What is your new equation? Do we have any questions on this process so far? One of the points. Yes, you do not need to do both. You would just get some. So you do need to do this part, the slope, and then you just do one. Yeah. Let's do number 4. So let's find our slope first. 8 minus 3 over 0 minus a -1. What would that slope be? Which would simplify to be 5. Now, in this case, in cases like this, if you go to do one of your points and you see that there is a 0 in one of those, use that point because it will make your life easier. But also, if you see that this is 0 on the y, what point is this? It's the y-intercept, which means we don't need to solve to find the equation. We have our slope, we have our y-intercept. Y equals 5x. You don't need to do the rest of the work because you were given your y-intercept. Now, you may forget that and still do the work, which is fine. You should still get the same. But if you see the y-intercept, you don't have to do the rest of the work. Work for the slope, but not the rest. Right? Questions on that one? I want you guys to try the last 3, 5, and 6. And then we'll come back and talk about those 3 and then Anyone else want to come up and do 3, 4, 6? This was the answer to number 5. If you saw that this was the right answer, you didn't have to do the work, but if you did the work, that was also fine. The slope for this one was 0 minus -8. Next. Over -7 minus 5. Your slope would have been +8 over -12, which would simplify to be -2/3. Some of you saw this and thought this was your y-intercept, but this is your x-intercept. You can use that point to remember like your, but that is not your y-intercept. So if you were to use that point, you have y minus 0 equals our slope -2/3, x minus -7. You have to change the negative minus to a plus before you do anything else. This would just become y equals, and then distribute. So y equals -2/3 x minus 14 should have been that kind of. Just as we did above, some of your y-intercepts can be right. Does anyone want to find? It's fun. It's not what Lauren told people. I don't think that's what I'm saying. Okay. Okay. So for this one, some of you got the right slope and some of you didn't, so be careful when you are subtracting. So here, -2 minus 5 would give you -7. 5 minus a -2 would give you +7. Your slope should be -1. Some of you were getting 7/3, 3/7, something like that, because of the way you were subtracting. Be careful with that. Then it did not matter when you chose y minus, let's say I'm doing the first one, 5 equals -1 times x minus a negative. Once you get any of this, if you want to change that to a plus automatically, that's fine. But for right now, you should practice changing it yourself. So after we change that, then we can distribute and start to solve. And add 5 to the left. So y equals -1/2 x plus. Question. None of you know the gist of how it's supposed to be set up. And pick it up a notch. Find a blank page. So if you flip a couple pages of a blank back. Or all the way to the back, either or. And I want you to write these 3 things down. There's 2 right here, and then I'll move on. Leave space in between. So given 1 and 1/2, 2, 2, and 3, 6 and 1/8, with a slope of 1/11. The next one is given the point 0.03 and -5, 5/2. You need the first one again. The last one is given 0.5 and -3/2, 1. Okay. So this is going back to when we were doing the slope and it had fractions, very similar. But now it's taking that and what we were just doing and combining. So with this first one, if it didn't give us the slope, we'd have to find it. But we are given the slope, so we don't need to do that part. It's like added. We do, however, have to write the equation using one of these ones. Doesn't matter which one, but we have to convert them back to improper fractions. Multiply these 2, add whatever that is. So 2 plus 1 would be 3, and then over. Same thing here, multiply 6 and 8, add 1, put that over 8. What was that fraction? Over 8. 8 would be your 48 plus the 1 would be 49. Remember that you can do this in your calculator by putting in the mixed number, and then hitting enter, no change to an improper fraction. So now we have a choice. We have our slope. We just need to use one of these points if we want to use this one. In our point slope formula, y minus our y1, 2 equals our slope 11/4 times x minus our x1 is 3/2. Distribute. What would this become when we multiply 11/4 to -3/2? -33/8. In your calculator or backhand, add 2 to that. I think So the goal here is, if you could do these, you could do the previous ones. So this is just more, adding more. What questions do we have for this? I'm gonna do one more of these and then I'm gonna give you some practice. Okay. That's what it is. But if we did it by hand, we would multiply this both by the and then negative. Okay, this example, we don't have a slope, so let's find it. So this would be 5/2 minus 3 over -5 minus 3. Get common denominators for this one over 1, multiply it by it, multiply it by 2, there we go. So 5/2 minus 6/2 over, you can simplify this now or later. This is just 5. 5/2 minus 6/2 to give us half, -1/2. Take the denominator, flip it, multiply it by -1/5 in the numerator and the denominator. What is our slope? So this would be a positive 1 over. Now, I see a point that has a 0. Is that your y-intercept? Yes, so we don't have to do the rest of the work. We have our y-intercept. Y equals 1/10 x. Open up your iPads and Desmos. And this will help you do the last one. It will help you do the rest of the problems in the packet. It will help you the adult math. But you will not have this on your test. So use it to check yourself, use it to practice, but don't use it to give you the answer and not know it. So the next one is a little hard with the fractions. So I'm gonna go back and do one of the ones that we had already done, like number 6 from the previous page. I'm gonna put in those 2 points. So I want you to also put in those 2 points. So if you were given 2 points, you could use your graph to count. I'm going down 7 to the right, 7, so my slope needs to be -1. So it's very easy. We talked about that before. But what we're about to do, you need to be able to know what your slope is in order to do this part. So then we're going to type in the variable y equals mx plus b. So when you type in your y equals mx plus b, it's going to ask you to add in sliders. You want to add all. So type in y equals mx plus b, add all sliders. we know that the slope of this counted was -1. So I can change the slope to -1. Not the 1. And then to figure out what your b value would be, you're going to move this until it goes through both points. You can use this to double check yourself if you get the correct equation, y equals -1/3 x plus 3, which is what we found. We can see that it goes through those points, it has our correct slope, it has the right answer. So use this to check yourself. In about 10-ish minutes, I'll have you put your iPad and calculators away. But you can use algebraic method or desmos to work on the 2 delta maths that are due this week on writing linear equations. Some of you started one of them and finished that one. Some of you started the second one but wasn't able to finish it. Or you can keep working in your notes. There are many problems to practice using desmos or the algebraic method. Do that for the next 10-ish minutes and then I'll have you put everything away. You can work together, move around, but use this time wisely.